Before the story begins, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you even more compelling stories. I never thought a crumpled blueprint would be the thing that finally broke me. My sister slammed the papers on my desk, demanding I build her dream using my reputation, for free. I looked at her, then at my parents, who nodded like I owed them my life. Right then, holding the designs for a building they thought they controlled. I realized something terrifying. Blood doesn't make a family, it just makes a convenient excuse for extortion. And I was done paying. Looking at them sitting there with their demands, I thought back to all those years of cold neglect. I grew up in Chicago. From the outside, the Vance family looked like a portrait of success. We had a large house. We had a beautiful front yard. But inside those walls, there were two completely different worlds. Stella was always the delicate flower. She was the absolute center of my parents' universe. If she even coughed, the whole house stopped. When she was 10, she showed a slight interest in drawing. The very next week, my father hired a private art tutor. They transformed the sunroom into her personal studio. She had imported canvases. She had the most expensive paints. I was different. I loved numbers. I loved structures and math. But I didn't get private tutors. I got a public library card. Every day after school, I would sit on the dusty floor of the city library. I taught myself geometry and physics from old, heavy books. When the brutal Chicago winter hit, the difference between us became impossible to ignore. Stella was gifted a custom designer coat. It was thick, warm, and flawless. My father would drive her to her art lessons in the heated SUV. I had a rusty, second-hand bike with a slipping chain. I would pedal through the freezing wind just to get to the library. My hands would go numb on the handlebars. My old jacket barely kept the snow out. Whenever I came home shivering, my mother would just look at me and say, "You are so tough, Clara. You don't need to be coddled." There is a term for this in psychology. They call it the invisible child. Or the good child syndrome. When parents have one child who is always demanding or fragile, they pour every ounce of their energy into them. The other child is forced to grow up fast. They are forced to survive on their own. But the real tragedy is the silence. That independence is never praised. It is never rewarded. It is just taken for granted. My parents constantly told themselves that I was strong. They said, "Clara can take care of herself." They used my independence as an excuse to completely ignore me. It was their way to erase their own guilt. The more understanding I tried to be, the more they exploited my quietness. It creates a very cruel paradox in a child's mind. The harder you try to be good, the less love you actually receive. Because in my house, love was not a reward for effort. Love was a currency paid only to weakness. I remember one specific evening. I had spent a month teaching myself a complex structural drafting method. I finally got it right. I was so proud. I ran into the living room to show my father. He was holding up a messy, half-finished watercolor Stella had painted. He was looking at it like it was a masterpiece. I held out my drafting paper. He didn't even turn his head. He just sighed and told me to lower my voice. He said I was disturbing Stella's creative process. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked back to my room. I folded my perfect draft in half. I put it in the bottom of a drawer. That was the exact moment I stopped asking for their approval. I realized my achievements would always be invisible in that house. They saw Stella as an artist who needed a stage. They saw me as the concrete floor beneath her. I was meant to carry the weight. I was meant to be walked on. And I was meant to stay out of sight. I was just the background noise in their perfect family picture. They never cared how I survived the cold. They only cared that I didn't complain about it. When college started, the divide became a canyon. Architecture school was notoriously expensive. My parents sat me down before my first semester. They told me I needed to be realistic about money. In the same breath, they paid for Stella to spend 6 months in Paris to find her artistic inspiration. I didn't argue. I just packed my bags. I found a tiny, unheated apartment near campus. To pay my tuition, I took on 3 different cleaning jobs. I worked nights. I would finish my evening classes and go straight to the downtown office buildings. I scrubbed lobby floors. I wiped down glass doors. I emptied hundreds of trash cans. My hands were always raw and cracked from the industrial bleach. I would finish my final shift at 4 in the morning. I slept on buses. I slept in the campus library. I survived on cheap coffee and discounted bread. My family never checked on me. I saw their lives through social media. Stella posting photos from French cafes. My parents praising her creative soul in the comments. Not once did they call to ask if I could afford groceries. But the late nights eventually paid off in a way I never expected. It was a freezing Tuesday in November. I was cleaning the executive floor of Sterling Design Group. It was the most prestigious architectural firm in Chicago. I was completely exhausted. I took a 5-minute break and sat on the carpeted floor. I pulled out my structural drafting homework. I spread my blueprints out right next to my cleaning cart. I was so focused on calculating a load-bearing column that I didn't hear the footsteps. A shadow fell over my papers. I looked up. It was Mr. Sterling himself. He was the founder of the firm. I scrambled to stand up. I started apologizing, but he raised his hand. He wasn't looking at my uniform. He was staring at my blueprints. He leaned down and pointed at a structural joint on my paper. He asked me why I designed it that way. I was shaking, but I answered him. I explained the physics. I explained my reasoning for the weight distribution and wind resistance. He listened quietly. We spent the next half hour sitting on the floor, discussing tensile strength. A master architect and a tired janitor. When he finally stood up, he handed me a business card. He told me to come to his office at 9 the next morning. He said I was holding a mop when I should be holding a drafting pen. He gave me a paid internship on the spot. I walked out of that building feeling like I could fly. I was so proud. I called my father the next morning to tell him the news. I told him I got a position at the best firm in the city. There was a long pause on the phone. Then, my father sighed. He said, "That is fine, Clara, but do not let a little desk job make you arrogant. We are very busy today. Stella just sold a small sketch for $50, and we are booking a restaurant to celebrate her genius." He hung up before I could say another word. I looked at the dead phone in my hand. It was a harsh truth, but a necessary one. My foundation was going to be built entirely of my own sweat. And I would never let them take credit for a single brick of it. For years of exhaustion led to that one morning. It was graduation day. I stood backstage in my black robe. The auditorium was packed with proud families holding flowers and cameras. I was nervous, but for the first time in my life, I felt truly proud. I was graduating at the top of my class. I was about to receive the Dean's Award for Architectural Excellence. When the Dean finally called my name, the crowd cheered. I walked across the stage. The heavy glass trophy felt cold and real in my hands. It was the physical proof of every floor I mopped and every night I went hungry. I stopped at the center of the stage. I looked out into the massive sea of faces. I searched the middle section where the reserved seats were. I looked for my father's tailored suit. I looked for my mother. The seats were completely empty. I walked off the stage. The rest of the ceremony was just a blur. Afterwards, the courtyard was filled with students hugging their crying parents. fathers were taking pictures of their daughters. I stood alone near the iron gates. I watched them celebrate. I pulled out my phone and dialed my father's number. It rang for a long time. Finally, he picked up. I heard an echo. It sounded like he was walking through a large, empty space. I kept my voice calm. I said, "The ceremony is over. I won the highest honor in the department. Where are you?" There was a heavy pause on the line. Then, my father let out an annoyed sigh. He said, "Clara, do not start with this today. We are in the middle of something incredibly important." Stella finally found her dream penthouse in the downtown district. It has the perfect natural lighting for her new career as an independent art critic. We had to come sign the lease immediately before someone else took it. I gripped the phone tight. My knuckles turned white. I asked him if touring an apartment was more important than the day I became an architect. His voice instantly turned sharp and defensive. He said, "You need to stop being so selfish. You are just getting a piece of paper to become a glorified bricklayer. You draw floor plans for construction workers. Stella has a visionary mind. She is entering the high-end art world. We have to support the child who actually understands culture and prestige." I heard my mother's voice echoing in the background. She was laughing. She yelled, "Tell the broker we love the Italian marble." My father didn't even say goodbye. He just said, "Take the bus home, Clara." And the line went dead. I stood there listening to the dial tone. I expected to feel shattered. I expected to cry. But I didn't shed a single tear. The deep, aching need for their approval simply vanished. It was replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. They didn't just overlook my hard work. They actively resented it. They hated that my success was built on my own sweat, completely outside of their control. To them, Stella's illusions of grandeur were worth millions, while my concrete reality was worthless. I slowly lowered the phone. I looked down at the beautiful glass trophy in my hands. He called me a glorified bricklayer. But he was wrong. I was an architect. And I knew exactly what I had to build next. I needed to build a massive, impenetrable wall between my future and their toxicity. I walked out of the campus gates, and I never went back to that house again. Now, years later, I sat across from them in my own conference room. The silence was heavy. I looked at their expectant faces. They really thought nothing had changed. My father slid a rolled-up piece of paper across the glass table. He tapped it with his index finger. He said, "Stella is opening an immersive fine dining restaurant. She has the creative vision, but she needs someone to handle the technical blueprints. We want your firm to do the structural design and oversee the entire construction." Stella finally spoke up. She crossed her arms and smiled. She said, "It will be amazing exposure for you, Clara. You can put your name on the foundation plaque." I slowly unrolled the paper. It was a crude, impossible sketch. The proportions were entirely wrong. I looked at the notes in the margin. She wanted a glass ceiling holding a rooftop garden, supported by nothing but decorative wooden pillars. There were no load-bearing walls. The kitchen ventilation was completely ignored. It was just a childish fantasy drawn on very expensive paper. I looked up at them. I kept my voice perfectly calm. I said, "You want my firm to dedicate months of skilled labor to build a structurally unsound restaurant. And you want us to do it for free." My father's face instantly hardened. He slammed his hand on the table. He said, "You owe this family, Clara. We raised you. We gave you the tough skin you needed to survive in this cutthroat industry." My mother leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. She said, "If you turn your back on your sister now, people will know. We will go to the architectural press. We will post on every social media platform. We will make sure every client in Chicago knows exactly how ungrateful and selfish the great Clara Vance really is. My father pointed a finger at me. He said, "We will tell your board of directors that you are unstable. We will ruin your reputation before you even finish your next project." They were threatening to destroy the career I built with my bare hands. They were willing to burn my life down just to keep Stella comfortable. They truly thought I was still that little girl shivering in the snow. They thought they still had all the power. I looked down at the paper again. I stared at the address written at the bottom of Stella's sketch. It was an abandoned commercial warehouse in the West Loop district. A very specific, highly coveted location. I let out a slow, quiet breath. I opened my own laptop. I clicked on a master file, pulled up a thick legal document, and turned the screen around so they could read it. I said, "This is the deed to that exact property. Sterling Design Group purchased that entire block 3 weeks ago. We are tearing down the interior and redesigning the whole space." My father frowned. His eyes darted across the legal jargon on the screen. He said, "What does that have to do with anything?" I looked him right in the eye. I didn't blink. I said, "It means I am the lead director on that site. I am the one who personally approves every single commercial lease for that building. I own the space Stella is trying to rent." The room went completely dead. Stella's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock. My mother clutched her purse, her knuckles turning white. My father stared at the screen, and the arrogant, demanding look on his face simply melted away. He looked small. He looked entirely powerless. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together. I said, "You came here to blackmail a glorified bricklayer. But you forgot whose office you were walking into. You do not have a project without my signature." I watched the realization wash over their faces. The silence in the room was absolute. My father's jaw clenched tight. Stella looked down at her hands, completely speechless. They finally understood that the girl they used to ignore was now the woman holding the keys to their entire future. My father opened his mouth to negotiate, but I didn't let him speak. I picked up Stella's expensive sketch from the glass table. I slowly tore it right down the middle. I tore it again. I dropped the ripped pieces into the trash can next to my desk. I looked at them, keeping my voice perfectly steady. I said, "The answer is no. I will not build your restaurant. I will not lease you my property. And I will never let you use my name to fund your illusions." My mother suddenly stood up. Her face turned red with anger. She yelled, "You cannot do this to us. We are your family." I just shook my head. I reached over to my desk phone and pressed the intercom button. I calmly told the front desk to send security up to conference room B immediately. I looked back at my mother. I said, "You are not my family. You are just the people who made sure I knew how to survive the cold." Security arrived less than a minute later. My father tried to maintain his dignity, buttoning his jacket as the guards firmly asked them to leave. Stella wouldn't even look at me. I stood by the glass window and watched them get escorted out to the elevator. The doors closed, and they were gone. I stood there for a long time, looking out over the Chicago skyline. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. People always preach that you must forgive your family, no matter how much they hurt you. But no one ever teaches us the real price of that forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean you have to leave your front door wide open for the people who constantly break into your house. There is a very thin, invisible line between having a forgiving heart and simply punishing yourself. People will call you bitter. They will say you are holding a grudge. But refusing to help a toxic family is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival. It is pure self-defense. True maturity is not about opening your arms to everyone who shares your last name. It is about having the terrifying courage to finally say no. It means accepting that you will forever be the villain in their story. I know exactly what will happen tonight. They will go back home. They will call their friends. They will tell everyone how cruel, cold, and ungrateful Clara has become. And I am completely fine with that. Because accepting the role of the villain in their fake world allowed me to become the hero in my own reality. For my entire life, I thought the heaviest weight I carried was the steel and concrete of the buildings I designed. But the heaviest weight was actually the hope that my parents would one day love me. Dropping that hope was the greatest relief I have ever felt. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my chair. I opened a new, blank blueprint on my screen. The page was completely clean. The structural foundation was entirely mine to build. And for the first time in my life, my mind was perfectly quiet. I was finally, absolutely free.